Hey there, Nectartakis here. In this video, we're going to go over debugging a container error that produced no log output. This was a scenario that happened recently while doing some client work, and what made it even more fun was it only happened in production. So throughout this video, we're going to be going over this blog post, which will explain the problem set, some of the steps I took to debug it, so maybe in the future, if something similar happens to you, you'll have a heads up. By the way, right now this blog post is hosted on localhost, but at the time that you watch it, it will be available on my main site. I'll leave a link to the description, and we will be jumping into the terminal to run some of these commands just to see how it works. But yeah, let's start with the problem set first. It's kind of a fun one here. So imagine this, you have a typical web application, right? You have like web application server, maybe you have a background worker, database cache, etc. here, and it's happily running in production and everything is working great. Then you deploy a new version of your code and the web container doesn't start up successfully. Instead, it errors out here with a generic exit code such as 255 or basically any non-zero exit code, right? Something went wrong here. And if you take a look there at your stopped web containers logs, there's no output at all, like not even a single line here. And if you happen to be using something like Kubernetes, the events really only say crash loop backoff with no other details at all, right? There's no stack traces or additional information that you couldn't get from the logs. However, the background worker using the same exact Docker image does start up successfully. And in addition to that, let's say that the new version fully runs fine on your local dev box, and it also builds and runs fine successfully in CI, right? All of your tests are passing here. And even to go one step further here, after all of your tests pass in CI, maybe you push your Docker image up to the Docker Hub or some other Docker registry here, and you do some due diligence, and you actually pull down that exact image that was pushed to your registry from CI, and you run it locally, and it works. Pretty interesting. So you go even further and you just remove all the volumes from your Docker Compose YAML file, maybe let's say if you're using Docker Compose here, just to better replicate production. Nope, same thing, completely works fine. Although probably in CI you may have volumes disabled or removed. At least I do that just to be a little bit more similar to production. I kind of feel like that's a nice step to do here. But yeah, let us know in the comments below, like what would you do in this spot to start debugging this problem? Now I'm not going to pause the video. We're going to go into some of the solutions here even pretty early on here. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting one to think here. But yeah, this happened for some client work, and it was quite an adventure to figure out what happened here. So yeah, like what happened to your containers logs? And I always like that one scene from The Matrix where it's like, what good is a phone call if you're unable to speak? And then Neo's lips fuse together, right? That's a really unsettling scene. By the way, spoiler alert, sorry, it is like a 20-something-year-old movie here. But yeah, what if your process can't speak because something prevented it from running? And that something could possibly be an entry point, right? A pretty basic Docker entry point is something that we see here, right? Where basically the idea is, you can run some custom code before your process has a chance to start. This last line here is going to pass control back to your process and run whatever command that you have, is running with Docker there. And cool, okay. So, imagine if we're using something like error exit here, or set-e for short here, that will halt your script on any error. So if you have some command being run here and it happens to exit with a non-zero exit code, and it also happens to not produce any log output there, then your container is going to stop because set-e is going to halt the script, and you're not going to receive any log output at all because maybe your command or logic or whatever just doesn't produce any output there. And yeah, your process never had a chance to run there. And you can actually test this, right, by running the command false, which will exit 1 and produce no output. So in terminal here, you can run this command false here. Notice, $ turn red, something failed. You do the last exit code here, and you can see that it's 1. Now, I've got this application up and running here. It's an open source Dockerized Flask app. Leave a link to that one if you want to check it out. Not super important here. But, this application does have an entry point here. It copies some assets to a different directory. But yeah, let's just drop in a false here and see what happens. So this one happens to use set-e, same exact thing as the -o error exit, just a shorter way to do it. I actually prefer using the longer one, but whatever, that's not important for this video. So we have our false line in there. Cool. Okay, so let's restart the containers and see what happens when we actually run this. Okay, and we can see right away in a second here, it says web application, exit with code 1. And we really have no other details, right? There's not a zero logs that were output here that we can see what actually happened here. But yeah, just to be a little bit more clear, with the entry point stuff, let's just drop in like an echo with some like tracer bullet here. Maybe I'll just put a cool here, and then we can rerun this here and we'll see what happens here. The idea here is we're going to see that cool output before the Unicorn, which is the application server, starts. And there it is in the output here, right? We can see it. Nice, happily output, everything is good to go. Didn't even have to rebuild our Docker image. Nice, okay. So going back to the blog post over here, I also mentioned here that you can actually confirm this behavior with the false thing at least, or any failing command here, if you actually just remove that error exit line, because then the rest of your script will at least have a chance to run here. So if we go back to adding false here, but we decide to comment out this line, and then we rerun things, then we would expect that our application server will run in this case, even though that false command is producing a failure. And again, you're doing some debugging steps. Maybe you can try something like that out. Here's the web application. It's running completely fine. Now, depending on what you're really doing in your entry point, in this case, this false command failing has no bearing on the Unicorn app server. So of course, Unicorn is going to start correctly. But in this case, in your case, maybe a more real world use case, maybe if something fails, it produces like a config file that needs to exist in a certain spot. Maybe that will make your application server fail, but then you'll at least get more informative logs because then your application had a chance to run and it's going to produce something useful so you can be like, oh, missing config or, something, whatever it happens to be. So yeah, just something to think about there. And I don't know, one takeaway is if you're running some custom command or logic there and it fails, it really is quite helpful to have that produce some type of log output, right? Just to give you some direction here. Because if your entry point has a lot of things going on, you may end up having to almost do like a bisection search on that and just start commenting stuff out to, until you figure out the exact line that's being problematic there. By the way, I didn't bring this up here, but this entry point does start every time you run your container. So you don't want to do any heavy lifting things there. Whatever you're running in here should run pretty quick. You wouldn't want to have your container be paused for a couple of seconds here for something to run, but that's really aside for this video here. It's also quite useful to have a health check on your container because, if you don't see your health check's output, whatever it happens to be, maybe an HTTP request in your logs, you can at least draw a pretty quick conclusion that your web apps process didn't even get a chance to run here. Now, in this specific case that I had though, you could end up with a slightly more complicated use case here where you have some conditional logic in your entry point where, maybe you only run something like this if the app env is in development, right? This could be some environment variable that your application sets up here. And that's not too crazy, right? When your container starts, maybe you do some, some quick like cache related command to optimize things in production or some other non-development environment there. So that could totally explain why something works totally fine in development and CI, but fails in production here. And the case there is in dev and CI, you have this set, but in production, you have something else. So then that command here in this condition here never gets a chance to fire. And that's really an example of, it's a little bit dangerous to have conditional logic in there. And it's not dangerous in the sense that like you're doing something bad, but it can totally bite you in a scenario like this where, this code path never has a chance to get run in your dev environment or your CI setup. So yeah, maybe you can do something different. Like maybe you can have a special pipeline command that runs with your app in like a non-development setting here, just to make sure that gets executed here. But at the very least, just having an awareness that stuff like that exists could definitely help you avoid this problem in the future here. And that's actually what happened in this case here. So there was an issue here with some cache command that was being run, and it really was only a problem in production here. And yeah, I feel like if that command were to output something, some type of error log, then this whole adventure could have been a 5-minute non-adventure with a little bit more log details. But yeah, let's go back now to how it worked for the background worker, but failed for the web application, because that's like, what the heck is going on here, right? So maybe in development, you're using Docker Compose, but in production here, you're using Kubernetes, right? But that's not too unreasonable, pretty common setup there. And in your Docker Compose setup, you can override things like the entry point and commands and other stuff, but maybe in Docker Compose here, you didn't override your entry point to do nothing for the worker because, maybe your entry point is, modifying a web application config file that really only needs to happen for the web container, but not the worker here. But in Kubernetes, maybe as like some type of optimization or whatever, your web deployment and your worker deployment, these are different deployments, like Kubernetes deployments here. And, you're running different commands for each one of these things. And maybe the web application uses args to set the command, but the worker container uses command. And, if you're not into like low-level Kubernetes stuff, the real takeaway here is there's actually a huge difference between overriding a command with command and args, because if you supply command but not args, only the command runs. Your actual entry point will be ignored or skipped. If you supply args but not command in your entry point, the opposite of that one, then yeah, your entry point will run, and then the args that you supply there will override the command with whatever. So yeah, if that would definitely be a scenario where it worked for the worker, but it failed for the web here. And just circling back, maybe you did that as a micro optimization here, because technically you don't need your entry point to run in the background worker. Now, the takeaway there for sure is if you're doing stuff like that, then you should probably be doing that in Docker Compose as well, just so your dev and CI setup is more aligned with what you're doing in Kubernetes. If you're not running an entry point for something in production, then yeah, probably shouldn't be running that in development as well. And with Docker Compose, you can actually just set the entry point to an empty list here in your worker to cancel it out. In fact, I actually think I am doing that here for the worker. Now, again, this is one of the cases where something didn't really need to run for the worker. So yeah, I just nulled it out here with an entry point like this. That's just one way to handle that one. I suppose the takeaway of this video is just to have an awareness of, how you actually can have a crashing container produce no log output due to a Docker entry point. So yeah, if you have any questions about this, let me know in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer all of them. Let us know some of your war stories too. Did something like this ever happen to you in the past? And if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.